And again, we want to continue these conversations, maybe more getting closer to food service and the retail side of things. And to do that, we have invited David Fikes, who is Vice President, Communications and Consumer Community Affairs for Food Marketing Institute, which is a trade association for supermarkets, grocery stores, and all manner of food retail venues. So Dave will tell us more about his role there, and he will expand on these important topics. So thank you, Dave.
Okay, Rick, thank you so much, and appreciate the invitation to be here with you. I need to know a little bit about my audience. How many of you are veterinarians? Okay. How many of you are service providers? How many of you are academicians in the academic community? Okay. We'll go about. All right. Okay, I work for FMI. FMI is the trade association for supermarkets, grocery stores, and about 26 of the top food manufacturers in America. And so we represent, and for the longest time, FMI focused exclusively on food retailers, think grocery stores. Now, again, part of the audience participation here. How many of you think that you do at least 50% of the grocery shopping in your household? How many of you do at least 50%? Okay, good. Good. Y'all are normal. Good. Appreciate that. Couple of assumptions that I have that I want to run by you, just so you know where I'm coming from. And if you disagree with these assumptions, we got trouble with the rest of the presentation. Okay? My assumption first is that a satisfied and happy and safe consumer is the common objective or the end game of every element in the food chain. And by every element in the food chain, I include veterinarians, because you play a role in food safety, you play a role in animal safety and in animal welfare. So you are part of the food chain. And we all have this common objective of a happy consumer. We all want that person at the end of the day to feel like, yes, I am safe eating this product, and it tastes good, and I'm happy. Okay? All right, so that's my first assumption, that you are all part of the system. You're part of the game plan as we talk about gene editing and as we talk about consumer acceptance of gene editing. Number two, the food chain is no longer farm to fork. It's now lab to lips. Okay? So it has become more complicated. It's become more complex for two reasons. One, because it includes laboratory and scientific data now as part of what consumers need to know about in order to feel okay about the food they're consuming. But also, because of the second point, today the food chain is less of a chain and it's more of a fiber optic cable. Because of vertical integration, we do not have separate links. We can't say, this is my responsibility up to this point, and that's where my responsibility ends. It's now kind of interwoven, and the conversation from the consumer has to go all the way back to the laboratory where the seed may have been developed or where the science was done in terms of producing, a disease-resistant pig. It includes all of those conversations. Then my next assumption is that food retailers are the food industry, the face of the food industry to the consumer. We're the ones that interface most directly with the consumer. What this means is we have to have all the information that goes all the way back to the lab in order to answer the consumer's questions that they're asking about the food that's on the shelves of the supermarket. We have to have access to that. We have to know that if we're going to represent the entire food chain to the consumer. Because you might be like my middle daughter, who really thought that eggs were hatched back in the back of the supermarket. She never thought about that they were somewhere else and then delivered to the supermarket, because the supermarket is where all the food came from. Okay? So we're the bridge, and in the shopper's perception, we have to know what's going on so that we can answer the questions. And I'm going to say that I was the head of communications at FMI when the whole GMO fiasco kind of hit, okay, and it hit the fan. And I will say that part of the issue was that the food retailers did not know and could not answer half of the questions that the consumers were asking because we didn't have the information and we didn't know. We're trying to remedy that this go round, okay? Because none of us want to repeat that scenario. But I would also hasten to remind you that GMO had been on the market for 20 years before it hit the fan with the consumer, that there were issues with it. It had been out there and safely consumed for 20 years before suddenly people started questioning. And you know what the issue was that the consumer had with GMO? It wasn't about food safety. It was about, you did this and you didn't tell me. I didn't know that's what you were doing. If you had told me, I may have been okay with it. And then we got some business practices mixed up in the mix of all that, and it became a horrible situation that we are still trying to recover from in some ways. And then finally, and this comes straight from Alvin Toffler, author of Future Shock, but also author of Third Wave, who said, in our technology age, information is the primary commodity of exchange. Not just money anymore, it's about what do you know and how do you know it. And so food retailers do not just sell food, they are the arbiters of information. We keep trying to tell our members, you don't just sell that stuff that's on your shelves. You got to know about it and sell the information as well because the consumer is wanting to know about it. Now I'm going to try to get you a little bit more into a consumer mindset with this because the traditional consumer food equation, in other words, the questions that for about 50 years, from 1940 until 1990, the main questions that, and I'm going to say she because at that point most grocery shoppers were female. The three questions they had was, how much does this cost? Is it convenient? And how does it taste? In other words, can I afford it? Will it be easy to prepare? And will the family eat it? Those were the three questions that they had in their heads as they walked the aisles. We started seeing the shift start to take place in the 1980s, and other things started to happen, and now this is what it looks like. Right? And you'll notice it's male and female because more male shoppers keep going up. You know, it's almost 50-50. It's about 45-55 right now, but it's on the rise. Okay? And the questions they want to know range all the way from, was the worker treated fairly, to was it mentally processed, was it ethically sourced, is it environmentally sensitive? Now, am I saying every consumer is asking all of these questions? No. But if you have 100 shoppers in the grocery store at any given point, all of these questions are getting asked. Okay? About 25% of them are asking about environmental stuff. About 14% are asking about labor practices, and about 10 to 12% are asking about GMO-free. Okay? So that's the question. Let me show it to you in a different way. The shopper evaluation or value equation for 1950-1990 was this. Cost plus convenience plus taste equals a sale. Ooh-ah, sale. Okay? Now, this is what it's like today. Okay? Much more complex, much more complicated, a lot more questions getting asked. Now, let's look at this in terms of the importance of transparency. And my friend Keeley talked about this somewhat, but I'm going to give you some stats about it. If you add all this up together, 90% of consumers say that, with varying degrees of importance, that transparency is important. In other words, when we say transparency, it's providing detailed information about what is in their food and how it was made. 90% say that's important, that I know that, and I have access to information about that. Say? Okay? This is why we at FMI decided we're trying to get ahead of the game on gene editing. And back let's see, we did this in 2019. It took forever to do it, so we started in 2018. But we published a white paper on the implications of gene editing for the food retail industry. We wanted to give our people the beginnings of the vocabulary because they had to get those words under their tongues And some of those words were hard words, like transgenic. And what does that mean? And for it to be non-transgenic, what does that mean? And we tried to help them begin to understand. Again, this is our retailers. These are the CEOs and the CFOs of the companies to understand that there's a difference between gene editing and gene modification. Okay? So we did that white paper. We did our first round of consumer research about the consumer acceptance of gene-edited foods in 2020. We all know what happened in 2020. Literally the last public meeting that I attended was the release of that information in that particular piece of research. So as you can imagine, it kind of went nowhere because people's attention was looking elsewhere. But what we learned from that first piece of research is that only about 10% of the population had even heard the words gene edited. When we pushed into how much did they know about it, about half of them had heard the words and thought they knew what it was, but really, when we push into it, about half of them did not know really what it was. Okay? The big learning that we had, though, from that is in terms of acceptance, and again, this is reiterating something that Keely talked about, is that if you're going to try to help a consumer feel safe and feel good about it, you don't lead with the science, you lead with the benefit. You've got to say what's in it for them. And what we heard and what we learned was that, number one, health benefits were the most resonant message with the consumer, that it's better, somehow better for them. Okay? The second one was that there was some kind of production value in terms of the safety of the animal or the safety of the plant, more disease-resistant, drought-resistant plants. That resonated. In other words, kind of environmental messages were very big. What did not resonate was that it was good for the farmer. And this was our fault. We did not connect the dots for the consumer. And guess what? You have to connect the dots for the consumer. Okay? They have to understand that when it's good for the farmer, that actually means ultimately it's good for me. It's good for the environment, it's good for the cost of it, and it's good for the production value of it. We joined, and you heard from my friend Keely again, the responsible use of gene edited. We joined it, and we were supportive, and we are actively endorsing it. Why? Because as the retailer is the face of the industry, we've got to know the answers. And I wanted to make sure that we had access to a way of finding the answers quickly. And that's if you're getting someone asked on the aisle what the answer is, and they don't know, they can go to the back, look it up, come back and give them the answer. Okay? But they had to have that resource to know how to answer that question. And the predominant question that consumers are going to ask is, why? Why are you doing this? To what end? What's the value? What's the benefit that I'm going to accrue? And what's driving this for you as a producer and as a customer? Our last piece of research that I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on what the findings were, was just released a year ago. And it was, again, when you do research, your first round of research, basically, all you're doing is finding out what you should have been asking, right? Okay? And so that's kind of what we learned. And what we've said is, okay, if they really want the benefits, how is it that we convey those benefits in a way that is mindful of their need? Okay? So a little bit about the process. Surveyed 2003 U.S. shoppers. That means pretty robust, in survey work. We were examining who consumers trust for information on bioengineered and gene-edited foods. We wanted to know about the customer awareness of technology and labels. We were testing about the BE label, and so who knew what that was and how were they applying it. And then we also wanted to know about customer preferences and willingness to pay for bioengineered and gene-edited products relative to, in other words, compared to, USDA organic, non-GMO, and conventional romaine lettuce. So what we did was we tried to recreate the scenario of a supermarket. We gave you, 5 bags of romaine lettuce. One was marked GMO-free, one was marked organic, and one was marked gene-edited, and one just didn't have any of that kind of labeling on it, and they were all offered at different price points. And when you do that over and over and over again, you start to see what the consumer preference is, and also whether or not they will pay for this. I will tell you, let's go ahead and get into the findings. Consumer finding number 1 was acceptance of gene-edited food remains low with those who access the additional information. Because in addition to giving them those choices, we gave them the option of saying, before you go through this, you can look up what all of these mean. What does it mean to be GMO-free? What does it mean to be gene-edited? How many of you think that over 50% of those surveyed looked at that information before they started it? Believe it or not, 59% looked at the information before they started the survey. We were pleased about that. So the willingness to pay for gene-edited foods went up if they had looked at that additional information, if it was also marked with the BE label or QR code saying you could get additional information about this. You could find out about it. Key finding number 2, benefit messages increase consumer acceptance and the willingness to pay for gene-edited food products, and even result in a willingness to pay premium. In other words, it started scoring higher than conventional romaine lettuce if you said, here's the benefit. We're also giving you some information about this that's backed by USDA or FDA, and we're also giving you information from the manufacturer itself via the QR code. So if you reinforce the benefit message with additional information from sources that they trust, yes, they will start to increase their willingness to pay. Now, you remember that I said that back when we first did this, about 3% said that they had heard about gene-edited, but only about half of them really knew what it was. Well, in a matter of a couple of years, we started to see that the knowledge of new food technology still remains low, and food labels are the most preferred, trusted information vehicles to acquire product information. But let's look at the data here. In the purple, that's gene modification, GMOs. In the light blue, it's bioengineered, what that means, okay? And then gene edited. In the category of heard about it and I know what it means, it's gone up to 33% that feel like they heard of gene editing and now know more about it. Now, a lot of that has to do with what Keely was alluding to, that in the medical world, a lot more practices are going on where gene editing is starting to be out there in the public domain, public vocabulary. However, when you look at heard about but do not know what it means, 25% said that, and still 42% said never heard of it before. So, if you're asking that fundamental question of are consumers going to accept a gene-edited product, my answer is yes, but we have a lot of work to do, because what our indications are is that they've got to have information available to them from a trusted source, and they've got to know what the benefit is to them, and they've got to know it readily, and that means on-pack labeling. Okay? Now, this is where we get into a little bit of a serious conversation about whether or not that needs to be mandatory. And it gets complicated, because if you label gene-edited BE, what have you done? You have lumped it over there with what? GMO. Okay? So how can we make a distinction between labeling something that's gene-edited, because we think it's important that the consumer understand there's a difference, and you've heard both presenters before me say the same thing, is that we know that there's a distinction that needs to be made, but how can we keep it clear via labeling? That's going to be the big caveat, the big question. Okay? Key finding number 4 is that respondents' trust and knowledge about different information sources addressing the new food technologies differs substantially, okay? With respondents indicating a high level of trust in government agencies, but not the U.S. Congress. Any surprises there? Okay? This is what it looks like. In this grid, you want to be in the upper right quadrant because the vertical is about knowledge, and that doesn't mean knowledge of gene edited. It means the consumer's knowledge about that entity. Okay? And then the horizontal is about trust and whether or not they trust it. Now I love this because look over here. Facebook is in, I have a high knowledge of it, but I don't trust it. That's good news in my world, okay, I think. Now, our U.S. Congress over here in that same quadrant, I have a high knowledge of it, but low trust of it. CNN and Fox News both fall into that quadrant. I know those entities, but I don't trust them. Okay? Interesting, isn't it? Look over here, though, in high knowledge. Family members, and I trust them. Okay? Now, I don't know about your family, but my family knows precious little about gene editing. Okay? So I don't know how much I need to trust my family about getting information about gene edited foods. But have a high knowledge of them, high trustworthy. Look over there in terms of the highest level of trust, okay? And knowledge. FDA, USDA, and the American Medical Association. Now, you don't see vets up there, but I lump all of you over there with the American Medical Association because I think you carry the same degree of credibility with consumers that the medical associations do. And you'll see Humane Society right there on the line, almost dead middle of everything. But this gives you a sense of who they trust and what their knowledge of that entity is. Not the level of knowledge that that entity has about gene editing, but it has about how comfortable I am and how much I trust. Key finding number 5, and by the way, it's only 6, so we're coming in home here. Okay. Respondents are in favor of having foods produced with new food technologies available in the market. When we ask to say, even if you don't think you'll buy it, do you want this available to you? Guess what? Consumers always want choice, right? They always want the options. They always want to know that that's available because I might change my mind if I get more information. But they support labeling of gene-edited food products, and they back a federal decision makers for labeling issues over state-based ones. We're all grateful for that because we like interstate commerce. And once you start getting a state-by-state thing, it gets to be real messy. Here is the breakdown of that particular fact. The number of consumers that wanted the decision made by the U.S. Food and Drug, the FDA, 69%, almost 70%, said we really want the federal agencies to weigh in heavily on this. I don't know, 11%, you know, all the rest break down single digits in terms of clearly the preference with consumers is they want the agencies acting like the agencies. They want them to make a clear presentation about it. Now, should we be pressing then for mandatory labeling of gene editing? We're not, FMI is not in that position to say that because we are, again, fearful of it getting associated, guilt by association, with gene modification, GMO product. And so what we're urging the agencies to do is as you make your decisions about how you're going to monitor this, and as you make your decisions about how you're going to keep up with this, be loud about it, or at least be clear about it, so the rest of us can be loud about it, okay? So that the consumer hears from the agencies that they trust that this is deemed safe product to consume. Last finding, and you're going to love this one. Save this one for last for you. Consumers consider gene editing applications targeting diseases in animals, humans, and crops as highly important, and applications targeting sensory or productivity indicators to be of low importance. What does that mean? On this grid, you want to be on the right side. Look at the top. The top vote getter, when we ask, what is the application that you think we really ought to be looking at? Guess what got number 1? Even above human disease control, research on gene editing farm animals to increase their resilience against diseases. And again, if that's not clear, if you bump down to number 3, research on gene editing farm animals to make them resistant against potentially deadly viruses and diseases. So clearly, if consumers have a preference and what they want out there on the market are gene additive products. They really want the ones first that are really protecting the animals and protecting, again, human disease, raising human disease resistance. Now let me stop there. Let me hear your questions.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
We do have time for questions, but there is one,
Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Just wanted to come back to that point number 6, talking about the application of using the technology to improve health in livestock. I think we already have a good example on the market of this, which is use of antibiotics in livestock, right? So I think there it's pretty clear that antibiotic usage in livestock is meant to improve the health and the welfare of the animals. If consumers are making a conscious decision that they want to forego antibiotics in livestock because they're prioritizing the potential risk on their own health.
Yeah.
So what can we learn from that in terms of how that applies to this type of situation? And do you have any comments or feedback on that one?
That's a terrific question and really does put it into a context that we need to be examining. I think it has to do with what's the information that's available to the consumer about the use of antibiotics, because as we press into it, that if you're using antibiotics as a way of saving, the animal's life and preventing disease, we're finding there's a softer consumer reaction to it. If you're just saying that we're willy-nilly, administering antibiotics, and again, this is where I think consumers are very subject to misinformation and scare tactics from some groups, that they fall prey to that. And again, if they fall prey to that, then it requires that we do 7 different kinds of communications about the other side to even try to undo the misinformation that's there. And even then, you get some that you can't change their minds. There's some learnings there about what do we present, how do we present it, and what's the trustworthy. The reason why we ask about the trustworthiness is we need to know the conduits through which we need to be operating, okay? To provide the information available to the consumer and to make sure that that is not just marketing, but it is really solid information. But we've got to lead first with benefit so that they know what's good for them and they know why we did it, and that they understand that there was a lot of thought, which is why we do the responsible use of gene editing, is to make sure that we were asking the right questions and that we got the right answers when we ask the right questions. And then we can provide that information and backup and resource to the consumer if they so desire. The other thing about transparency is consumers don't always look it up. Again, only a little over half looked up went the extra mile with looking up the information, how you define that. But they've got to know that it's available to them if they go looking for it. And it's got to be easy. It doesn't look like it's hidden behind some kind of firewall. I don't have a good, quick, easy answer to your great question, but I just know that there is something about paying attention to the misinformation and how do we address the misinformation that's out there, or better yet, how do we get good information out there first so we're not having to play catch-up ball and undo the misinformation. That would be my quickest answer to it, but great question.
Any other question? Yeah.
I'm sorry, gang, I'm sweating because I'm hot, not because I'm nervous, okay?
What can we learn from the Aquabounty salmon, the GMO salmon that was a great product? It was introduced to the market 15, 20 years ago, $70 million effort, but nobody's buying into the concept from the retail standpoint of view.
Yeah, and this is one test case that we really need to look at, because, and there's one of those where the timing was horrible, because I will tell you, many retailers came out and said, we're not going there, because after having had a horrible experience with gene modification and in the plant world, they said, we are not going to transition over into the animal world and try to sell people on that. I think it was a great product. Met many times with folks from Aquabounty, and we set up meetings with some of the retailers, and they just, again, back to some Keeley's research, if it isn't gonna sell or we're gonna get resistance, we're not going there. We'll steer you over here to this other product. So it was a learning about bad timing. It was a learning about, again, Aqua Bounty was, I think, a little bit of a victim of the retailers that were afraid to go into that space.
One last question, perhaps. You alluded to that often in terms of the messages, the business practices, they get mixed up in the message on some of these technologies, and it's more about the business practice than not the actual product. Can you make a comment about what can be associated to gene editing here, and then we will need to get ready for that?
The argument that if we gene edit something, we'll be able to use less fertilizer. When I said we didn't connect the dots for the consumer, we didn't say that has environmental implications. Where they went is, oh, that means the farmer doesn't have to buy as much fertilizer, therefore it's a benefit to the farmer, not a benefit to me. So that's when I was saying that we have to connect the dots about what the benefit is and be very, very clear about exactly what the benefit is. And we're better served if it's clear that it's a benefit to the consumer. The seed companies with GMO, they wanted it to be a benefit to their customers, which were the farmers, and they didn't really pay much attention to what was the benefit to the customer. And so we have to make sure that it's a clear benefit. It's why I think Pairwise is doing so well, is because theirs is basically they're taking a natural product and saying, we're just making it palatable for you. It's good for you to eat, but you can't eat it in its natural state. We have to gene edit it. I'm Southern, you can tell by the accent, and I've eaten collard greens and mustard greens if you don't put a lot of ham hock and a lot of other stuff in there, you can't eat it. And of course, you've boiled away all of the nutrients to it. So it was a great product to hit the market first, I think, even though it kind of falls into that latter category of being kind of a product sensitivity. But it's making it palatable and it's making it healthy and saying, we're giving you a natural product, just making it where you can eat it. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're getting such a warm reception. Did I answer your question, or did I dance around it?
There may be, I was thinking more about practices even at the farm level that are more of a direct implication for the
If there are applications at the farm level, we have to make sure that we connect the dot for the consumer to say that if this means that less fertilizer, then that does mean less input, but it means environmental good news for you, but it also means perhaps a lower cost of the product.
Very good with that. We'll leave it here. I would like to thank all the three speakers for their presentation.